For those that are still with us, the dedicated ones here in the building and of course online. My name's Mona Yakubian. I'm a senior advisor at the U.S. Institute of Peace. It's my great pleasure to lead this final conversation of what has been, I think, an extraordinarily rich day of discussion. I don't think my colleagues need any introduction. Without them, none of us would be here. But we have Shiraz Maher, of course, from the International Center for the Study of Radicalization, and Charles Lister, a senior fellow here at the Middle East Institute. And what we thought we'd do, as if they have not worked hard enough, is have them together in a conversation with me, really think through a lot of the key takeaways and thinking for next steps based on not just today, but private discussions that occurred yesterday. And of course, as a reminder that a similar series of discussions was convened last month in London. And let me begin, I forgot to congratulate you on really an extraordinary set of discussions, both in London and here in Washington. I think you are to be commended for shining a light on this incredibly difficult challenge, and frankly also bringing a transatlantic lens to it, which I think is incredibly useful. So why don't we start, and maybe Shiraz, I'll start with you. I thought before we start talking about charting the path forward, let's unpack a bit your thinking, your key takeaways on how we define the challenge. You know, to what extent has your own thinking about either the narrative around the detainee dilemma or the ways in which we think about the different populations, how has that changed, or what new insights have you gained based on the cumulative knowledge of all of these various conversations that you've been having?
Yeah, well, thank you for the introduction. I think based on everything we've been talking about, I think even just Charles and myself, when we were thinking about how we began to conceive of these events all the way through to where we are today, it's quite clear that we've evolved just in that period of time in terms of thinking about the fact that this is clearly a situation in which we've almost been caught in a loop, and we tended to keep going around the same issues again and again. And I think there was a lot of senses in which a lot of the various stakeholders, politicians and others who were looking at the issue were tending to do so in fairly siloed ways, leading to sort of one-dimensional sort of thinking about this. So we had those who are looking at it from the humanitarian aspect, who are very concerned, obviously, with that side of it. Those who are looking at stabilization efforts, those who are looking at it from a more hard and securitization aspect, CT approaches, that kind of thing. I think what we've illuminated from all of these discussions is to use a metaphor I used yesterday. Actually, it's a bit like pressing down on a balloon. When you hold one aspect of it, the air displaces to other parts. As we're acting independently and thinking about the issues independently, we are simply moving the problems in different ways. And I think that's one of the sort of key takeaways, is if we're going to start to think through tangible aspects, it's about disaggregating the individual actors, but also disaggregating our timeframes in the way we are looking at this. So we've talked a lot about the immediate short-term issues, the medium-term issues, the longer-term goal of ultimately removing this population from the current status that it's in, is, you know, that status of arbitrary detentions in different ways inside northeastern Syria. So I think it's about really finding what those practical next steps are going to be, beginning to also accept and realize that as much as we talk about that sort of community of foreigners who are part of this, this is primarily and principally a Syrian and Iraqi issue. The pressures that are placed within the broader system of the current status of where Iraq is, the current status of where Syria is, and the status on those communities, that's going to have an inevitable and sort of symbiotic impact on that foreigner community and the foreign community upon them. So at the risk of going on and sort of recapping everything, I think just that sense of the disaggregation, the timescales, shifting the narrative of how we talk about this issue, how we conceive of it, is going to have to inform the sort of practicalities of what we think about advocating next.
So Charles, I'm going to pick up exactly on that point and ask you to also provide some of your takeaways, again, particularly with this on this idea of narrative. And we've heard so many diverse perspectives on the challenge, whether it's Josh Geltzer, who sees it from the NSC as the lead on counterterrorism, Dana Struhl from DOD's perspective. Earlier in the day, you had representatives from the State Department, the acting coordinator, and of course, from USAID. Each one of them offers a different vantage point from a US government perspective. And then we had the very moving discussion of the situation in the camps as seen from the humanitarian perspective. In your view, given the complexity of this, what is your takeaway on how best to frame the narrative around this particular problem set?
So first off, Mona, thank you for taking on this last role and for your participation over the last couple of days. And of course, Shiraz, for your partnership. My head's a bit of a fuzzy mess at the moment after the past couple of days, but I think, you know, to be really honest with you, when Shiraz and I first came together and came up with this idea to do this, we knew this was a hell of a troubling and complicated and messy and potentially intractable problem. And that's why we got together to do it. To be honest, having discussed it and hashed it out from all those different perspectives, privately yesterday and publicly today, it's an even harder problem than we originally thought. And precisely because there are so many overlapping components. I mean, one of the core things we need to do, I think, a lot better as governments, as analysts, and as an international community is to better disaggregate the various challenges inside this whole topic. So we cannot lump together or paint with a broad brush the whole 60,000 population of our whole as potential terrorists. We can't do that. How we disaggregate that community, whole nother challenge. We need better access into the camp, which means we need better security within the camp, which means that we need, you know, better trained, more capable, literate SDF forces on the ground to do that job. We as the international community need to be providing the necessary equipment and training to create databases, not handwritten notes, to know who is where and where they are and how many family members there are. You know, that's just like one little snapshot of the whole bigger picture. On narrative, I think that's been one of the most interesting sort of takeaways, is the idea, the reality that 8 years ago, when ISIS sort of exploded onto the public scene in Iraq and Syria, the international community purposefully and rightfully created a narrative that was shaped around fear and the threat of the foreign fighter flows of ISIS, of what it represented. I think within that narrative, the concept of a child or a woman or a man within ISIS was represented an equal level of fear and threat. Now, the narrative that we created, rightfully so within that context, is now our worst enemy when it comes to tackling this problem. That narrative is precisely why there are still so many governments who either openly refuse to repatriate or who have gone down alternative routes of severing or revoking citizenship and simply, you know, pulling up a wall or a drawbridge and saying, we want nothing to do with it. So can we reshape that narrative is an enormously consequential question. Do we reshape that narrative to say the short-term fear of bringing these people home should be overridden by the long-term fear and concern of leaving them where they are? But there's some concern about that because we're still using a narrative of fear. Do we embrace approaches by some smaller governments, some in the Balkans, some in sort of Scandinavia and Northern Europe, who have been repatriating people, but not publicizing it? You don't talk about it, you don't make it a big public deal, you just do it. And you use local communities, local resources and civil society to return, rehouse, repatriate, rehabilitate. I don't have an easy answer. I think it's going to have to be on a case-by-case basis, but clearly as a coalition, we need to reshape the narrative. If the coalition knows this is a big problem, we need to get away from that short-term fear narrative that has rightfully shaped much of what we've done over the last 8 years, but is now arguably our biggest biggest problem or biggest obstacle.
No, I think that's exactly right. I think well-intentioned efforts to draw attention to what is sometimes a forgotten challenge does have this sort of adverse effect of, in fact, hyping the threat, hyping the scare in a way that undermines the ultimate solution. And so it sounds like as part of the charting the path forward, there is a whole piece on narrative and on strategic communications and on understanding how to frame this incredibly complex challenge. I want to drill down a little bit further into the idea of disaggregating population. Shiraz, you mentioned it, Charles, I think you did as well. I know for me, having tracked this for some time, that was a big takeaway, was in particular the issues, the challenge of adolescent boys and boys who, particularly in the annex where foreigners are at age 12 or 13 or 14, age out, as it's called, and are often transferred to either rehabilitation centers or even to prisons. Let me start with you, Shiraz. Can you talk a little bit more about the very particular challenge presented by boys in detention who often, some of them are child soldiers and have been in prison. Others are in rehabilitation centers, and yet others are young boys in El Hol. But if this is a long-term challenge, they will, of course, grow and may end up themselves being sent to either prison or rehabilitation centers in the absence of a solution. Can you talk a little bit about that particular population and what thoughts you have on it?
Yes, this builds upon some of the things we've been saying, and that narrative aspect in particular. The children are victims. It's very, very clear. All of the children in various capacities and different ways are victims of this conflict, of ISIS, and of everything that's happened since as well, including the arbitrary detention that they're now experiencing and suffering. And so clearly what we're seeing here is a situation in which, and we've heard it in the various other panels, the conditions in which these children are living, deprivation of access to education, basic sanitation, just the social aspect of being a child. It's essentially denial of their childhood and opportunity and access for those kids. Now, again, what is the end goal that we're seeking to achieve? We talked in the morning about mitigating risk, managing risk, and so on. But ultimately, with these children, it's about protecting them and preserving them from exposure to ideology, exposure to war trauma and the psychological traumas associated with experiencing conflict, witnessing horrific things, whether that's the death of parents, executions, the ultra-violence of ISIS that they may have seen when the so-called caliphate was standing over parts of Syria and Iraq. So again, they will have experienced all of these different things. And now the situation is a completely hopeless one. Even if they've been removed from that sort of frontline battlefield experience, they are often being detained in environments, as you said, where they age out in particular, with men who are hardened individuals who in some cases have done and seen and experienced quite horrific things, and are staying in a general population with them. There's no really, in any way, meaningful or material support system for these children. And like I was saying in my opening remarks in this session, it just reinforces that loop that we're in. This is the long tail. If this generation isn't off-ramped, it's clear what happens next. You don't have to be looking into a crystal ball to make a fairly accurate assessment. I think it's just worth saying, I mean, when we talk about stabilization and so on, the underlying structural issues that led to and facilitated the rise of ISIS in the way that it was able to take territory so dramatically, to hold it and to build on local support in order to try and do that. Those underlying structural issues haven't just disappeared. In many respects, they've got worse. These children will be exposed to that. So again, this is I would say this is the urgent aspect of what is a very important problem. And within it, the urgent aspect is to deal with the children, and again, to essentially off-ramp them as quickly as possible.
So let me turn to you, Charles, exactly on this. And I think earlier in the day, it was just taking up on Shiraz's comments, it was described as the largest, maybe most complex protection challenge in the world. And so again, understanding it that way and understanding that this is not, well, there are the humanitarian and frankly moral issues about these being children, but also it's not a static problem. Children are growing in the camps, and so eventually they are moving into this other status. What were your big takeaways, Charles, on this particular piece of this very complex challenge?
Well, I guess a number. First is, as you say, that it's a kind of transient or constantly evolving situation. Children grow up. I know I've got a young daughter. She's like older every 3 months, but these children are rapidly growing up. They've been in this situation in internment or detention, depending on how we define it, for 3 years. 3 years is a long time for a young child. And before that, they spent as long as 8 years living under some kind of jihadist state. That is, the amount of trauma that can be associated with that cannot, I don't think, really be measured. So the first thing is it's transient and it's evolving. The idea that 12-year-old boys are being picked up from tents in the middle of the night and shipped off to essentially share mass prison cells with battle-hardened jihadists, smacks me as completely illogical, but it's happening. It's happening under our noses. And in a strange sort of ironic way, the only reason we really found out was because ISIS attacked a prison and revealed to the world what exactly was happening inside that facility. So one is recognizing the urgent necessity of fixing that precise problem. Associated with that, it's quite clear from some of the public comments today with the INGOs and the Red Cross that, this whole concept of rehab centers is not what it's been described as. These are not, as we've been told by people who spend considerable time in them, these are not rehabilitation centers. They're essentially another form of detention. They have, children are allowed 1 hour of outdoor time. There's no toys or soccer balls. There's no real educational materials. It's just another form of holding children. And in these cases, it's mostly a form of holding children away from their families or from their mothers or parents. So if there are to ever be actual rehab centers or just simply better forms of internment for children, that strikes me as something we could probably do, but we're not. So as a kind of interim solution and disaggregating these various populations, there are seemingly very easy immediate interim solutions. But of course, again, it requires funding and resources, and everything comes down to that. And this whole issue, as I think has probably been quite clear, whether it's either said or unsaid, is something that no one wants to take overarching responsibility for. Whether it's different parts of the US government, state has a role here, DOD has a role here, USAID has a role here, but no one is leading any of these efforts. So just merely to make a decision on building rehab centers, who's going to take the decision, who's going to raise the money, who's going to do the construction, who's going to find the builders and the resources to do it. Just that could take 3 years to make that kind of a call. And that's just within the US. Within the coalition, presumably it's even harder. So there's that. And then one final takeaway, take my sort of counterterrorism hat off and put my Syria analyst hat on and broaden Shiraz's point and say, none of this has happened and is happening in a vacuum. We've heard about Turkey's threats of an incursion repeatedly, but it's not just that. We are talking about one corner of Syria. Syria writ large is probably the most complicated conflict, and it's not a conflict, it's conflicts in the world. And so talking about doing a lot of these things, even talking about bringing in resources through the SDF to build rehab centers is going to create the ire of Ankara, and that can have all kinds of other spillover effects. The Syrian regime and Russia veto cross-border aid resolutions, which has a knock-on effect into the Northeast. Israel's willingness and continuation of strikes against Iran create further instability in northeastern Syria. It puts our forces on a sort of higher form of red alert than they would be otherwise. It distracts them from various other mission sets. So much as it's important for us to tackle these very specific issues, none of them are going to be solved in any form until we deal with
Yeah.
the rest of Syria. And as Shiraz rightly said, the root causes that gave birth not just to ISIS, but the entire crisis in Syria, almost every single one of them are worse today than they were in 2011 when the crisis started. But we don't discuss that anymore because the international community is distracted and fatigued and wants to hand Syria off to other governments or other bodies. But if we're going to ever take this seriously, we have to take the rest of Syria's crisis equally seriously.
So you anticipated exactly where I wanted to take this, which is sort of the context in which all of this is happening, the geographical contours of this challenge. Let me just draw you out a little bit further, Charles, first before turning to Shiraz. So you laid out quite well, I think, the complexity of Syria, of Northeast Syria. There is, of course, also the fact that Northeast Syria is in the midst of essentially an economic meltdown. It's also suffering from the enormous impacts of climate change, significant food insecurity. One of the issues we've heard is that one of the obstacles to return for the Syrian population of the camp is simply an issue of livelihoods. And these are, of course, typically women-headed households. So can you draw out just a little bit further how we should view this challenge from the context of the receiving communities in Syria in particular? And then Shiraz, I think I'll turn to you to speak a little bit about Iraq, since these are the two biggest populations. And if either of you want to add on about either of those or the broader, frankly, global community that's also implicated in returns, please add in that as well.
Yeah, well, thank you for raising it, because I think as we've heard from a variety of speakers today, much as our original early intention for the conference, I mean, it was the intention of the conference was to focus on Western repatriation and Western citizens. The core of the problem is Syrian and Iraqi. The vast majority of Al-Hol are Syrian and Iraqi citizens. Shiraz can talk about Iraq, but there are lots of, there's an openness in Baghdad to do it, but there's reasons why it's still very slow. In Syria, again, to really emphasize my point that I just made before, the vast majority of Syrians, we're told, in Al-Hol are from territories now controlled by the Syrian regime. And so we, as sort of legitimate, law-abiding, allegedly law-abiding governments, cannot return Syrians to areas controlled by the Syrian regime. Now, the Red Cross works with the regime, but the Red Cross is not going to be repatriating Syrian citizens to Damascus or wherever. So for now, there's almost no solution to that unless, lo and behold, Syria hat on again, we resolve the rest of Syria. But even for Syrians who are from the Northeast or other areas in which we are able to sort of operate and negotiate with local communities, so that there has been a fairly significant effort in the Northeast and in Eastern Syria to return local members of local tribes through tribal mediation. And essentially the tribes provide a guarantee to house, secure, monitor, and kind of reintegrate these citizens back into their areas. And there have been cases where this has A, been done, B, has worked, but there is quite a bit of anecdotal evidence that those deals are very far from perfect. And there has been recidivism, to use the technical term. There have been Syrians who have gone straight back to ISIS. The night they get back to their communities, they're straight back into the fight. So I don't know necessarily what the answer to that is beyond building local capacity, more stabilization funding, and bettering the situation within these areas of Syria that it relates to.
Shiraz, what about Iraq?
So I think there's similar dynamics at play within Iraq, and as Charles mentioned, if we refer to Syria as a series of conflicts, I think that's the broader picture that we can also deduce in Iraq. It's obviously incorrect to try and reduce it to a singular thing, but there are various components. So within Iraq, there is obviously a huge degree of stigmatization of those who have joined ISIS, who are seen as having been part of this and destabilized Iraq further than it had been already after 2003. So there's a lot of tension there. Then Iraq itself is dealing with how it's, I suppose, absorbing and integrating the various Hashd-e-Shabi militias that had been involved and taking quite a leading role in fighting ISIS, who are now, again, presenting a sort of quite interesting security dilemma to the security apparatus of the Iraqi state, how you reintegrate them. And again, they're not a monolithic organization. So you have that same capacity as in Syria, outside influences, different actors with different loyalties, different interests, who are trying to secure different things in that capacity. We've heard already today, Iraq is repatriating, and there's been a lot of credit given to Iraq from this stage. But again, those numbers, while significant in the context of repatriations overall from that community of detainees in the Northeast, is still relatively modest. I think it's worth contextualizing it in that way. And so again, this is the start of a process. Yes, it's materially significant, but there's still clearly a lot more to be done.
So before I pull from you guys next steps, the way forward, what were the most creative recommendations and ideas you've heard? Before we do that, I'd ask each of you to just give me a sense of what are the key knowledge gaps? What are the key areas that we don't know enough about, that we need to know more about, and that frankly might benefit from greater investment in research and understanding? Shiraz, let's start with you.
At the most practical level, based on everything we discussed, a census of who's there. I mean, we don't know who's there. And we've heard examples, again, of particularly these children, these young boys who grow up, that age out from the, and it's not clear where they've gone. Even the SDF and others have kind of lost them within the system. At the most basic level, in the first instance, who's there? What were they doing? Just that basic sense of what was your role? What were you up to? How did you end up here? Will allow us to use the old Donald Rumsfeld phrase, get the known knowns and the known unknowns about this community, and start to work out, I suppose, just what that topography is of that community. Once we have that, in an ideal world, you would have that immediately, right? And then you can start to say, this is the sort of ways to stage various interventions.
Charles, what about you?
So I totally agree on that. And I think in order to do that, so let me rewind. I think certainly from what I have gleaned from conversations and public sessions, both in London and in DC, is that there is still quite a hesitancy or a resistance from any single actor to take overarching responsibility for this. We heard from DOD, we support the SDF's ability to manage the prisons, but it's not that we are managing the prisons, because we don't want to take on that responsibility. We are providing support to the SDF to better secure Al-Hol camp, but we're not securing Al-Hol camp. So access to information, collection or collation of databases, biometric information, it's being done. There is biometric collection, and databases. But one thing we've certainly heard is the lack of, numerical lack of qualified, and an emphasis on literate SDF like registrars for just registering people in. There are illiterate people, illiterate young men and women who literally can't write, whose job it is to register incoming residents of Al-Hol, but they can't write. So, let's go right back to the basics. And if we are going to place the emphasis on the SDF to take on this role, then we need to do better at not just building walls and building fences and providing computer equipment for biometric collection, but the really basic skill sets necessary. That we've had discussions about the SDF's collection of judges to conduct local tribunals, none of whom have any judging experience, but they've been named judges and given the responsibility to sort of make certain decisions on local cases. So capacity building within the SDF and our local partners, I think, has to be a really big one.
I'll add one more to the table, which is, I think, deepening our understanding of what happens with returns and reintegration, and getting a sense, because we talk a lot about anecdotal evidence, both in the positive, and Charles, you've articulated in the negative. But I think we don't have a deep enough understanding, and we aren't studying well enough what happens upon return and reintegration. And, again, there's quite a bit that's been done in Central Asia. There, I think the story has been relatively positive. We should understand that better. We should draw some lessons learned, and in particular as well in Iraq. Okay, so we only have about 5 minutes, and I want to get to the real punchline of, maybe I'll start with you, Shiraz. What were the big epiphanies you've had in terms of creative ideas, or that you've learned from those in the various discussions for a way forward? Where's the low-hanging fruit? What should stakeholders here in Washington, as well as in various European capitals, as well as in the region, as well as among key INGOs and NGOs, what's the best way forward? What's the low-hanging fruit to be pursuing?
So I don't think it's low-hanging fruit, but it's certainly the idea that caught my attention the most over these deliberations, which I certainly hadn't thought about. But I think that sense, as we discussed yesterday as well, was having a civilian appointment at a senior level within the coalition to actually take charge of this issue and to coordinate it and to act as a point person who's negotiating with the SDF on behalf of the various states, so that it's sort of happening in a more, I suppose, in a more consolidated way. And I think that having that individual there in a particular way to sort of, as I say, streamline those efforts, to think about them in a more concentrated fashion, and that essentially serve as a point person, would go a lot of the way to sort of removing the various different issues that individual states are facing in the individual ways that they're conducting their relationships with the SDF, trying to get what they need, and sort of just bringing it through the coalition and to essentially have that civilian point lead whose responsibility is to think these issues through.
Charles?
So that was going to be my number one, is leadership. I think every single actor, practitioner, government agency or organization that we've spoken to all know that this is a priority in one way or another. But nobody seems to perceive there to be a leadership figure who is solely responsible for this issue. And being able to appoint someone like that, whether it's an American or non-American, but within the coalition, I think would be able to take away some of the politics. It would depoliticize some of the decision making. Another thing, we've heard is that it's become increasingly complicated. There have been some improvements in this, but there's also been stagnation in other areas. But it's become increasingly complicated to convince the SDF to give certain governments access to their citizens to simply interview them and assess them for repatriation, because the SDF is putting conditionality on access, and they want either money or political statements of support for their autonomous administration. And in some governments' cases, they're just not willing to do that. So even when we have governments who are newly interested in repatriating their citizens, suddenly we have this new local obstacle. If we had a leadership figure who didn't represent the government of the UK or the government of France or the government of the United States, but represented a broader, coalition body, I assume, technically speaking, it would depoliticize some of that process. So leadership would be wrong. Resources is an obvious one. It's clearly this issue isn't well enough resourced. I think there is seemingly a consensus that regional governments don't resource this kind of issue nearly as much as they should do. It almost seems like that's a small elephant in the room, that some regional governments in the Middle East haven't repatriated their citizens either, and they're also not paying up to provide interim funding to better secure the prisons or the camps or anything else. That sort of leads me to one other sort of out of the box idea that we've heard, which is using the kind of, I forget the phrase, but from the kind of global warming
carbon credits.
So using like the equivalent of carbon credits. So for governments who refuse to be constructive on repatriation, they can make up for it by providing surplus funding for other kind of interim solutions. Frankly, I'll take my American hat off as a US citizen and put my British hat on and say, I think the UK's policy on this has been abysmal on repatriation. But what the UK has done more is provided more funding for securing the prison facilities, far more, I think, than almost any other government within the coalition. So they seem cognizant of the idea that, okay, we acknowledge and we recognize that we're not necessarily being as helpful as you'd like us to be in one area. Let us be helpful in another. And I think there could perhaps be more of that. But funding and resources is always the the be all and end all of everything.
Mhm.
Nothing's going to get done unless we have the funding and the resources and the manpower to do it. So I think we have to come to that too. But a way of better burden sharing
Mhm.
would seem to make sense, because even the interim problems are going to require an enormous effort. We heard Fabrizio Carboni from ICRC today saying, we as humanitarian actors with large resources are already doing way more than we ought to be doing. This isn't just a humanitarian crisis,
Right.
it's a political security and a humanitarian crisis combined. And we as governments are forcing so-called neutral INGOs to do way more than they ought to be doing within their existing mandates. And so if we are to square that circle, then we need to be putting more money and more manpower onto the plate to try to resolve the situation. Looking at a whole right now, in the summer, they've had a massive surge of snakes and scorpions. Yeah. And people are being bitten all across the camp, but they don't even have like basic medicine or anti-venom to treat it. So people are rubbing garlic into their wounds and dying in many cases, including children. The most basic things we have fallen short on in terms of that. So resources. Yeah. I think it still comes down to something that basic.
Well, I want to thank both of you for all of the work and dedication that has gone into today, as well as all the previous discussions. And I think in a way, by coming from London and coming to Washington, you are the embodiment of where I hope we are able to take all of this, which is deeper transatlantic cooperation on a challenge that has been almost uniformly, I was really kind of notable across the day by every stakeholder, regardless of where they sit. The challenge has been defined in a very similar way, and interestingly, so has the solution. And so that's a good starting point, I think, for taking all of this forward. Please join me in thanking Shiraz and Charles for not just this session, but an excellent day and tough discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.